Well, good afternoon, evening, whatever time it is, everyone. Thank you for coming. On behalf of the Save Acworth History Foundation, I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. It'll be a very interesting presentation. Our speaker is Dr. Albert Churella of Kennesaw State University. I did print out your bio. It is happily sitting on the printer, and I forgot to pick it up. So I will try to remember the best as I can. Dr. Churella has written several books on railroad history. Your first was called From Steam to Diesel, and since then you've written 3 books, I believe, on Pennsylvania Railroad.
That's right.
And I don't remember offhand, it was something about a Lexington Group, but I wasn't familiar with what that was.
Yes, I will
Okay.
explain that, and there's a story there, a bit of a one. Right?
I should ask you just to give your own bio.
No, that's fine, you're doing great.
So on behalf of Save Acworth, welcome Dr. Churella. We're looking forward to it.
All right, well, thank you, Andrew, for that introduction, for setting all this up, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for being here this evening. Yes, as Andrew pointed out, I am, in fact, have been for the past 23 plus years now, a professor of history at Kennesaw State University. I'm also the president of the Lexington Group, which is a 501c3 not-for-profit corporation that has as its members I guess I can say, a select group of individuals who are involved in senior level executive positions, academic institution positions, government agencies, and so on, involved in the history and practice of transportation. And I'm in the midst of planning and getting ready for our annual meeting, which will start a week from tomorrow in West Palm Beach, Florida. So wish me luck with that. So it should be all right. I think it's going to be, fingers crossed, it'll be fine. But as a professor of history, as they say, publish or perish, I do write books, as Andrew pointed out. My first book, which actually was an outgrowth of my PhD dissertation, was From Steam to Diesel, and it talked about the transition from steam locomotives to diesel locomotives, not from the perspective of the railroads, but rather from the perspective of the companies that manufactured them. And then I was asked to, I guess, take on a project to write a history of the Pennsylvania Railroad, a company that never operated anywhere near Georgia, although in a way it sort of did. I'll get to that in a minute. But it was at one time the nation's largest and arguably the most important railroad. And for about 20 years in the late 1800s, it was the largest business corporation in the world at the time. So it's a big project. Came out to be 3 volumes. All told, something like 2,300 pages and about 1.6 million words. The last volume is, actually I have an advanced copy. I got it about a week ago. It'll be in the bookstores, as they say, sometime in November. And in a shameless act of self-promotion, I have flyers over there from Indiana University Press in case you'd like more information about the books, all of which will soon be available from Amazon, that kind of thing. But what I want to talk to you about tonight is something a little bit different. That is the role that railroads played in the formation, the nurturing, the growth of Acworth, certainly, but more broadly, Atlanta and the entire Atlanta metro area, and Georgia too, for that matter. Maps are very illustrative, I think, and they convey a lot of information. I think actually geographers and historians are kind of alike in their areas of interest in the way they kind of process information. But one way you can think about maps is what is the purpose of a map? Well, it tells you how to get somewhere, typically. And one of the things you care about when you go somewhere is how long it takes to get there. That's true of my drive here from KSU campus. It took a lot longer than normal because of traffic on the freeway. But if we go back to the early 1800s, say 1830, and look at the spread of the railroad network, there's not much. Just fragmentary, a little bit of local lines. By 1840, we're starting to see some development, including here in the South, mainly from the coastal regions, from seaports like Savannah and Charleston, toward the interior of the South to essentially bring agricultural products, cotton mainly, to the seacoast for export.
And then by 1850, a decade before the start of the Civil War, the network is more robust still. And what that means is that in 1800, if you were living in New York City and wanted to get to, well, I wouldn't say Atlanta, because Atlanta didn't exist in 1800, but if you wanted to get to where we're sitting right now, it would take you probably about 4 to 4.5 weeks to get here, one way. By 1830, thanks to improved coastal navigation, canals, and early railroads, it could be done in maybe a little bit less than 2 weeks, which is still quite an investment in time, and I should point out the money as well. And so railroads played an important role in facilitating increased mobility, reducing transportation times. And one of the first, and arguably most important in the United States, was the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company. Now that name tells you something about early railroad technology, and that is they weren't sure how viable it was. So they were hedging their bets. Their charter allowed them to build both a canal and a railroad. Obviously, if the newfangled technology of trains didn't work out, they could fall back on the long-established waterborne technology. This is a company chartered in 1827, opened a line from Charleston, South Carolina, to Hamburg, South Carolina, right, same state. That's important because corporate charters are within the state, they don't cross state lines. Opened in 1833. And if you know your Georgia geography, you may know where Hamburg, South Carolina is. If you don't, it's where Augusta is, or actually more precisely across the Savannah River from Augusta, which of course is in Georgia. And so the reason for this has to do with something called the fall line. And that is basically, think of it this way. If you imagine every river along the Atlantic seaboard, really from Florida all the way north into Maine, really. And you imagine sailing or paddling upriver. At some point, you're going to run into a waterfall or some other barrier to navigation where you have to stop and you have to portage around it. And if you connect all of those places and all the different rivers, that becomes the fall line. And on the Savannah River, it turns out the fall line is at Augusta or across the river in Hamburg. And so Augusta became an important kind of transshipment point where cargoes are brought over land, put onto boats, and taken down to the Atlantic seaboard, which is great if you live in Georgia because it boosts the Georgia economy, not so much for South Carolina, particularly for the city of Charleston, which actually is not even on this map, it's just off to the right, the white part there. So Charleston is well and truly separated from the mouth of the Savannah River near Port Royal. That's a problem. And the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company is designed to overcome that problem by building a line from Charleston overland to Hamburg to intercept traffic before it can hit the Savannah River and be lost forever to the commercial interests of Charleston. And you'll find that a lot, not just in Georgia and South Carolina, but all over, including the company I studied, the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was a project by commercial interests in Philadelphia to try to draw traffic away from rival cities like New York and Baltimore. So every port city is trying to kind of get their share of the pie at the expense of somebody else. Then there's a second company, the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company, and okay, here again, there's a kind of portmanteau title here, and that's instructive in a couple of ways. For one thing, obviously railroads cost money, so having a bank connected to railroad, that helps. But beyond that, we have to understand what a corporate charter is. A corporate charter is a grant of sovereign authority by a government to a private corporation, yes, in part for that corporation to make money, to earn a profit for investors. But also, this is very important in the early history of American corporations, the point is to perform some public function. So if banks have the authority to issue currency, which they did at the time. Then they make loans to encourage business and commercial development. Railroads have the power of eminent domain, that is to seize private property even though they're not a government entity. Then that power of eminent domain granted to them by the government comes with certain strings attached, including a requirement that they serve the public interest by providing transportation. So for all those reasons, it makes sense to have banks, railroads kind of chartered together, in this case in 1834. And this is an attempt by Georgia to kind of get its own back, right? To link Augusta, Georgia, at the head of navigation of the Savannah River, to Athens. And the charter provided for a branch, right, a secondary line to Madison, Georgia. The company was organized under, run by, engineered by the guy you see here, J. Edgar Thompson, who cut his teeth on this project, established a reputation as one of, if not the best civil engineers of his generation, before going on to be very important in the development of the Pennsylvania Railroad and that company's third president. Well, the branch to Madison was later authorized to be extended to a place called Terminus. The name, of course, is pretty self-obvious. It's where the railroad ended. And that's all anybody thought. It was a place essentially in the middle of nowhere. So here we are. There's Augusta to the right, with Hamburg across the river opposite. There's Athens, which was considered to be the far more important town than Madison. And then Terminus is off to the left or farther to the west. At the same time, the Georgia State Legislature chartered a second Georgia Railroad, the Western and Atlantic. In 1836, December 21st to be precise, it is from the beginning and remains, I should point out, a government project. This is an entity that is built by and owned by and remains owned by the state of Georgia. Why is the government owning a railroad? Well, the obvious reason is to encourage commercial development, improve land values, increase transportation mobility, all those other things. So the intent is to go from Fulton County somewhere, remember Atlanta does not yet exist, north to a city that does exist, and that is Chattanooga, important as a river town and also soon to become an important railroad junction. Construction proceeds in fits and starts, usually fits more than starts, beginning at 0 Milepost, which was originally at Forsyth and Magnolia Streets. In 1842, Terminus is established. Definitively, a year later, is incorporated as a town known as Marthasville, named for the daughter, I think, of one of the chief engineer of something in the Western Atlantic. And a couple of years later, it gets its current title of Atlanta. Building north from what we consider today downtown Atlanta, through Acworth, right? This is Acworth in the 1850s, through Allatoona Pass, which, according to some people, was the inspiration for J. Edgar Thompson later calling Altoona, Pennsylvania, Altoona. So it's not clear that that's actually where the name came from. In any case, Altoona became one of the most important shop facilities on the most important on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Construction also proceeded south from Chattanooga. The big impediment, as you might expect, was like a mountain, Chetubuta Mountain. The tunnel was finally holed through in 1850. It still exists, and you can walk through it. Some people, I certainly have. It's in remarkable condition, though obviously no longer used for railroad traffic. It's been bypassed. And so the company issued tickets, issued timetables, and you can see that this is not exactly a fast trip, right? The passenger train, right, the express, leaves Atlanta at 10 o'clock in the morning and gets into Chattanooga at 6:35 in the evening. And even with traffic as bad as it is on I-75, my guess is you can probably do better than that on most days, right? But it's better than walking. and it's certainly better than carrying freight via wagon. So the company acquires locomotives and everything, which would have gone up and down the tracks. They're like a block away from here and so on. And obviously it's still there. It is still owned by the state of Georgia. It's now leased by CSX. And I believe CSX just signed a 50-year lease, that's like 2 years ago, which should give the state of Georgia over that 50 years something like $2.1 billion in lease money, a lot of money anyway. And so as far as I know, it's going to stay state property for quite a while longer. There are a few others. The Macon and Western Railroad, chartered in 1833 as the Monroe Railroad and Banking Company. There is a banking and a railroad thing again. Name changes 1845, repeated a year later, from Macon to eventually it kind of creeps its way into Atlanta, which is now beginning to become a major railroad junction. There's the Atlanta and West Point, chartered in 1847 as the Atlanta and LaGrange Railroad, opened in 1854. And so by this time, Atlanta is a major railroad junction. And so in 1853, the city erects the Union Depot, which lasts for just a little over a decade, until 1864. I don't think I'm giving anything away to reveal that we probably know what happened to it in 1864, but we'll get to that. And so if we then look in 1860, right at the eve of secession and Civil War, we see that there is now a fairly robust railroad network in the eastern part of the United States, at least, that has further reduced transportation time from New York to Atlanta is now about 3 days, more or less, which is, a lot still. You can fly it in about an hour and a half, I guess, 2 hours. You can drive it in certainly less than 3 days, but it's better. And so if you look at more detail at the railroad network at the start of the Civil War, you see immediately how much more robust the railroad network is in the north, which plays a big role in the Union victory in that conflict. That, and of course, the size and industrial capacity of northern cities. And the South looks like it has at least a reasonable railroad network with good connections between major cities and significant geographic areas of the South. But if you look in more detail, you'll notice that a lot of these southern railroad lines are not well connected to one another. There are different gauges. Sometimes one railroad goes into one side of a town and another railroad then comes into the other side. There's a mile or so gap between them. And you might think, well, how difficult can it be to bridge that 1 mile gap? And the answer is, from a technological standpoint, not difficult at all. But from a public policy standpoint, much more difficult, because community leaders say, wait a minute, that mile is very important to us because it means that we have to transship freight, which means we have a lot of people working there doing that. Passengers have to get off, which means they're going to maybe stay overnight or at least have a meal in an inn or a restaurant. So, we don't want to lose that business by allowing trains to go straight through, which is, I guess, great for the commercial interests of the town, but not so great for transportation efficiency, particularly when it comes to moving troops and supplies during the time of war. And railroads, of course, did play a very important role in the Civil War. The Civil War is often called the first railroad war, the first time that railroads actually played a critical role in the transportation of troops and supplies, and in some cases making a critical difference in terms of who won and who lost a particular battle. And if we get closer to where we are right now, of course there was the kind of Western theater of operations as Union forces moved progressively down the Ohio River and the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers and so on, trying to get to cut the South in half, basically along the line of the Mississippi River. And it was because of that particular campaign, as forces got closer and closer, then eventually to Chattanooga, that one of the most famous, although I gotta say, least significant railroad-related military engagements of the Civil War took place. And that, of course, is the Great Locomotive Chase, which started not too far from here in Marietta, where the Andrews Raiders boarded the train, then stopped for breakfast at Big Shanty, which of course is now Kennesaw, and that's where the theft of the stealing of the locomotive took place. And then the Andrews Raiders moved up, right through here, and eventually managed to make it almost to the destination of Chattanooga to link up with Union forces just north of Ringgold, not very far from the Tennessee border. The intent, of course, was to cause as much damage as possible, to burn bridges, to tear up rails, sever telegraph lines, that kind of thing. In the end, the damage they inflicted was minimal. The raiders were caught, some were executed, others paroled as prisoners. And of course, there's the locomotive. It's not too far from here at the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History. It didn't look like that then. It's been heavily rebuilt, restored, particularly for the 1862 centennial of the Civil War. But it's in beautiful shape nonetheless. And then the other locomotive that played a key role in this, the one that did most of the chasing, is the Texas, which ran backwards most of the way from here to Ringgold. And it also has been beautifully restored. It is now at the Atlanta History Center. Finally, it was at the Cyclorama for a while in pretty bad shape, was brought here, restored. And what is interesting, I think, about this restoration is this locomotive, too, like the General, never looked like this at any one time. However, the people responsible for the restoration understood that a restored artifact is also historic, just as the original is. So rather than take it back to its precise appearance in the 1860s, they acknowledge that it has been modified over the years as a working, you can almost say living, breathing piece of history, and they have to be respectful of the changes that other people have made. Now, what is more significant is what happened in the summer of 1864. Of course, the Atlanta campaign, Sherman's forces moved south through this area along the line of the Western Atlantic, heading for Atlanta, which at the time was a very small city, right? But a critically important railroad and supply junction. The city is then evacuated by and large in advance of the arrival of Union forces. And this has got to be one of the last pictures ever taken of the Union Depot before it succumbs to fire, which was largely accidental, right? It was an attempt to destroy ammunition and supplies, keep them from falling in Union hands, and then the fire spread out of control. Sherman wasn't quite as vindictive as to burn that in Atlanta because he knew that he needed the resources of the captured city. In any case, the railroad resources took a particularly hard hit, and whatever rail resources were left that could be used by the Confederacy, of course, Union forces quickly dismantled. Recognize the importance of the railroads to the Confederacy. Now, in 1870, 5 years after Appomattox, the railroad network has expanded. It is now truly a transcontinental network, thanks to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in May of 1869 in Promontory, Utah. But what is more interesting, I think, is what's going on in the South. The South's railroads have been, as you might expect, badly wrecked by the Civil War. They are slowly, very slowly rebuilt. There is a tremendous opportunity for northern capitalists to invest in southern railroads. Certainly, individuals associated with the Pennsylvania Railroad, including J. Edgar Thompson, who's now president of the company, and his vice president, Tom Scott, in particular, are involved in financing and controlling the rebuilding of the Southern Railroad network. Not surprisingly, being Northerners, they get a reputation as carpetbaggers who are milking or exploiting the South's resources. That's not exactly the way it worked, but that's the kind of narrative that comes down nonetheless. But it's very clear that as the northern network is really becoming much more filled in, the South is really taking a while to recover from the war. But there is progress and rebuilding. There is a new Union Station built in 1871. It lasts until 1830 in the area kind of it's where underground Atlanta is, it's so-called the Gulch. Looks actually somewhat similar to the original Union Station. By 1880, the network has become much more robust. Thanks in part to this individual, Samuel Spencer, born in 1847, from a wealthy family, fought in the Civil War, was a slave owner, and later went on to take charge of the Southern Railway. There's a statue commissioned by the Southern that has actually moved to about 3 or 4 different places in Atlanta. It's now outside the Atlanta History Center, and as you can see by the number of plaques that are like beneath it explaining who he is and what he did, his legacy is, shall we say, complex, right? Railroad developer, Civil War soldier, slave owner, there's a lot going on there. And as president of the Southern Railway, he created what's often called an airline. It's not an aircraft, but airline is kind of the synonymous with the most direct, sort of think as the crow flies, route between the Northeast, Washington, D.C., and eventually all the way down to New Orleans and other important points in the South. So Spencer has probably more responsibility for the transportation and economic development of the South in the late 19th, early 20th centuries than anybody else around. And at his peak, Spencer oversees the Southern, but the Southern itself is part of a rapidly expanding Southern and indeed National Railroad network, which by 1930 has transformed American mobility patterns. And so now it's possible to get from New York to Atlanta in just about 24 hours, which is about how long it takes by train today. I imagine you can do it in a little bit less time by car, but not much. Flying is, of course, a different matter entirely. And so with that comes any number of new railroad facilities. There's the Atlanta Union Station built in 1930 and last 71, home to a number of significant trains. But the more important facility is Atlanta Terminal, the more impressive one, built in 1905, and it lasts until 1970 in this kind of Moorish revival architecture that might look familiar to you if you've been inside the Fox Theater and so on, very popular at the time. It hosted any number of important events. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's funeral train, heading north from Warm Springs, Georgia, where he died in 1945, and any number of trains to almost any conceivable part of the United States, through sleepers to anywhere from New Orleans to New York City and intermediate points, to Chicago, to Florida, all these places. Today, I should point out that there's one train, northbound and southbound Crescent, that's it. Far less than what you saw at its height, say, from the 1920s to the 1950s. And these are trains that, especially in the diesel era, are pulled by locomotives with beautiful paint schemes, providing service in many parts of Georgia. But all good things, I suppose, must come to an end. Americans love cars, still do, and flying. And you can see that there's a pretty healthy crowd outside the station in the late 60s, I guess. But it's actually a bad sign because so many people are driving and bypassing the roads entirely. The station, which is actually right here, It's where the federal building is today. That's looking more or less west. Mercedes-Benz Stadium would be probably right about here someplace. I think that curving S-curve, I think that's Martin Luther King Boulevard today. But in any case, it's surrounded by highways, hemmed in. More and more trains are discontinued in the late 60s, into the very early 70s. Those that remain are in really pretty rough shape, driving away patrons rather than attracting them. The thing is abandoned in 1970, falls into disrepair, and is then, of course, demolished, losing for all time this architectural treasure. And this kind of turning away of passenger service affects Acworth as well. The Acworth station, it says Louisville and Nashville Terminal, that's a predecessor company to CSX. It's their station, but the tracks belong to the state of Georgia. It had fallen into disrepair. The building, the edifice that was once sort of the center of life in the community, the way in and out of the city for countless people, is now an eyesore. And it really was. It was moved away from the tracks to another location. Part of it was demolished. There were efforts afoot to restore it, but it was deemed to be just too far gone to save, and there's, as far as I know, nothing left of it. Just as Acworth kind of fell on hard times, this is like downtown Acworth, and you can see how much change there's been. I could argue how much progress there's been in the past, let's call it 50 years since this photo was taken, both in terms of the quality of the tracks and the quality of the town itself. And it's reflected in a brand new station, one that, so far as I know, has never hosted a single passenger train, but it certainly looks the part, with then a pedestrian bridge spanning the tracks and so forth. Part of the revitalization of Acworth and an acknowledgement of this transportation heritage. But wait, there's more, and that is Georgia has a thriving and indeed growing rail system that is, I would argue, indispensable for economic development, linking major cities, including the now recently expanded port facilities in Deepwater, Panamax Plus or whatever, container terminal at Savannah, to all parts of the state and eventually the United States, across the United States, getting trucks off the highways, that kind of thing. And it may surprise you to know that a substantial portion of that trackage, about 540 miles, in fact, is actually owned by the state of Georgia. Not just the Western Atlantic from here or Atlanta to Chattanooga, but also short lines in other parts of the state. Some of that trackage has been actually abandoned in rail bank, but most of it is in service. So about a tenth of the active rail lines in the state of Georgia are owned by, well, all of us, as residents of, taxpayers of, voters in the state of Georgia, because the legislature concluded, and I think rightly so, that these lines were instrumental to economic development, transportation, mobility, job creation, economic growth, all those other good things. Not operated by the state of Georgia, but leased out to other operators, short line operators typically. Now, as far as passenger service, the story is a little bit less optimistic, but still there's reason for some hope, I guess. In 1971, Congress created Amtrak, technically the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, but to relieve the railroads of the burden, the extraordinary financial burden of providing passenger service, which, let's be clear about this, loses money everywhere. I mean, Europe, France, Britain, Japan, everywhere trains haul people, they lose money and are typically heavily subsidized. That's just a fact of life in terms of passenger operations. And so initially, Amtrak had a rough go, and this is actually Chicago, not clearly not Atlanta, with patched together equipment, gradually improved. It started with a fairly robust network but nothing that served Atlanta. Amtrak at its inception actually skirted the city through Decatur, Birmingham, Montgomery, Alabama. This is part of the Floridian, a train that linked Chicago with Jacksonville and then points in South Florida. It didn't actually pass through Atlanta, unfortunately. What was even more unfortunate is the Floridian ran over some pretty bad trackage, especially kind of north of the Ohio River, that resulted in all kind of delays and so forth, and it was discontinued in 1979, I believe. But the railroad passenger service that runs through Atlanta at the time Amtrak starts in 1971 is not Amtrak, it's the Southern. And the Southern is one of really only 3 railroads that elect not to join Amtrak. They keep their train in service, which they continue to call the Southern Crescent, linking Washington and New Orleans by way of Atlanta and Kennesaw Group. Now in 1979, the Southern finally just said, that's it, we're done. Corporate pride, right? Corporate image is one thing, but we were losing money on this. And so in 1979, the Southern turned the whole situation over to Amtrak. The Southern Crescent became just the Crescent, and it does. The old Southern Crescent, shown here at Peachtree Road Station, I-85, that's just underside those trees to the left, became the Amtrak Crescent with new equipment and so forth at the same Peachtree Road Station. Has anybody been there to the station? Okay, you've been there taking a train. Maybe. How many of you taken the Crescent? Okay, a few people. It's a great ride. I really enjoy it. It's a fun way, relaxing way to get anywhere. Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York. I do a lot of my research on the East Coast in places like Philadelphia and Harrisburg and so on. Great way to get there. Yeah, there are some delays. You may have heard that the Department of Justice is now suing Norfolk Southern over delays caused by freight traffic to the Crescent. We'll see where that goes. But the point is, I think everybody agrees that this station, while very kind of cute and attractive, is wholly inadequate for a city the size of Atlanta. It was never intended as the station for Atlanta. It was a suburban station. Basically, when trains like the Crescent came north out of Atlanta toward Washington and New York, people from, Buckhead and so on could get on the train here without bothering to go down to Atlanta and then back north again. So it's not really designed, it was never designed to be the station for the city of Atlanta, yet it has been for many, many decades. But change may be coming. I say maybe because I've been hearing these stories for literally decades, and I've seen very little concrete being poured. But there are plans afoot to rebuild the area essentially where the old station complex was. This is, if my geography is correct, Mercedes-Benz Stadium and so forth, and then sort of Midtown up there in downtown. So it's a important area in terms of rail transportation. There are plans for all kinds of redevelopment with green space, new buildings that live, work, play communities, and all of that. That will be tied into the campus of Georgia State University, the state capitol, recreational facilities like Centennial Olympic Park, Phillips Arena, the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, all of these kind of things, with all kinds of innovative architectural renderings for a multi-level transportation facility. All of it very green, obviously, with green roof, water-efficient landscaping, biodiverse. This is all great stuff, right? It's of course very easy. I shouldn't say easy. I'm going to put a lot of work in this. but very easy to make these very attractive drawings of what could be, whether the financial, political, organizational will to put this into place is going to happen. It's not clear. Amtrak keeps talking about building a new station more or less in that area, but you know, we'll see. Now, speaking of Amtrak, and Amtrak's not the only one, has a ambitious set of plans for improved connectivity and an expanded passenger rail network. A lot of this comes out of the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure bill that has budgeted, is it $2 trillion? I mean, it's a lot of money, of which I think $60 billion is going to passenger rail, which sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. But it's enough to encourage the Federal Railroad Administration to come up with all kinds of corridors, and for Amtrak to do the same thing, kind of parallel studies that would radically expand existing passenger routes. Basically what you see in the kind of rust color there, with the addition of a bunch of new lines, particularly kind of green lines, several of which would serve Atlanta, and here's the Amtrak service envisioned, ranging from improved service on sort of the corridor between, say, Greensboro, North Carolina, and Birmingham, a proposed high-speed rail line between Atlanta and Charlotte, which is currently connected by rail, right? The Crescent goes there, but it gets into Charlotte like 3 o'clock in the morning, which is not usually convenient. A number of routes that would connect Atlanta initially to Macon, then eventually to Jacksonville, and on into points in Florida, lines to Savannah, connections down to Mobile, and then ultimately to New Orleans along a route that is now very close to operating as the New Orleans-Mobile route. And then something that I would really love to see happen, Atlanta service first north of Chattanooga, and then extend progressively to places like Nashville, Louisville, and then on to Chicago. So I think it'd be delightful to have overnight passenger service between Atlanta and Chicago. Get on the train in the afternoon, have dinner, go to bed. Yes, I always get a sleeper, and then get up in the morning in Chicago, ready to go. That's a long ways off. Also proposals not reflected on this map, largely moribund, to build a high-speed line from Atlanta to Chattanooga, even proposals that the Atlanta airport, Hartsfield-Jackson, be connected to Chattanooga airport by high-speed rail as a mechanism for basically giving Atlanta a second major international airport. The status of that is like pretty much non-existent. You can imagine that the difficulty in building a great new rail corridor through North Atlanta. But we'll see what happens. As with the architectural renderings, it's very easy, I think, to draw lines on a map. More difficult to implement those plans. But something, I think, is going to happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years, given the extent of freeway congestion and so on. And I should point, there's a recent article actually in Trains Magazine, to cooperative efforts by the states of North Carolina and Virginia, each of which are very much invested in medium distance, that's like basically less than 500 miles, passenger rail service, even rebuilding. The plan is afoot to rebuild. It's called the S line, but it's an abandoned passenger rail corridor that's going to be revitalized for passenger service, basically to take pressure off Line 95, which is not just at capacity but over capacity. So, you know, potentially something like that could happen in Georgia as well. And that's about it. Now, that's the future, right? I'm exploring here however much time coming up with explanations of the past. We don't predict the future really. So that's the end of the formal presentation. Thank you all for being here. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
That's fantastic.
Well, thank you, appreciate that.
Yes.
I always heard that the width of the railroad track originated from the Roman chariots. The same with, is that true, first of all?
Well, yeah, maybe. I have a colleague named Dr. Pruffert who wrote a book, I mean, a pretty thick book too, on railroad track gauges, and he didn't definitively answer that question. So one rumor is yes, that it did. I think the consensus is that no, that was not it. That was that's a myth.
It's a great story.
It's a great story. It is a great story. Yeah. I think the explanation that Doug favors, and is one that I think has the most logic to support it, is that the original track gauge was set at 5 feet, which makes a lot of sense. It's a nice round number. And so the word went out from these pioneering railroads, and the first ones, how far apart do you want the rails? 5 feet. Well, what seems to have happened is people measured from the outside of the rail, not the inside. And so that would have meant that, let me just have to do my arithmetic, let's call it 4'8" to make it easier. That would have meant that the rail, each rail would be 2 inches wide. So if you count for the 2-inch wide rail, then the inside measurement, which is the one that really matters, is 4'8.5", more or less. I should say the one that really matters because early railroads experimented with a variety of mechanisms for keeping the wheels on the rail, the flange, basically. Although, in terms of railway engineering, it's not the flange that keeps the wheel on the rail, it's actually the profile of the wheel itself. And the flange is there basically as a last-ditch safeguard. It should not be contacting the rail on a regular basis. But some of the early lines had the flanges on the outside of the rail, or sometimes had double flanges. That is, the flange, it's a flange on each side of the wheel straddling the rail, which would then help to explain why you would want to put the rails 5 feet apart on the outside. That's,
Years ago, or decades ago, I was on rails all over Europe. Every country in Europe on the rails. The only unusual thing was they were all the same size, all the gauges were the same, until you got to Spain.
Yes.
When you got to Spain, you had to get off the train, get on the Spanish track that had a different rail. Do you know why that was?
Yeah, Iberian gauge. In that case, preference, as far as I can tell. And there are advantages to wider gauge track because you can carry larger loads and so forth. It's a trade-off, more expensive to construct initially, but then more efficient to operate. So as far as I can tell, it was a matter of national preference. Australia was a classic example. There were like 4 or 5 different track gauges because each territory in Australia started its own railroad system from the coast to the interior, and no one really thought in terms of linking them up. And then, of course, they had enormous problems in doing it. Now, in some places, Russia, for example, has 5-foot gauge. And that was a deliberate effort, right? Russia has been, understandably so, right? Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II, they've been invaded a lot by people from Western Europe. So it was a deliberate effort to make it more difficult for an invading army to simply transfer their 4'8.5" gauge equipment to the Russian lines. There are a lot of reasons. Gauge, as Doug Pruffert pointed out, the choice of gauge is really a declaration of war. In some cases, literally, as in the Russian experience, they wanted national security issues to be paramount. But it's also in terms of commercial war, as in the Erie, for example, had a 6-foot gauge for many years. And that was to basically ensure that no other railroad could poach their traffic. And it wasn't until much, toward the way they standard gauged it. So anyway, that's.
Wait, so why would they poach each other's traffic?
Because there has never been a coherent or consistent national transportation plan. If we go all the way back to the canal days, Albert Gallatin, who was Secretary of the Treasury, he surveyed, not personally, but he looked over surveys of basically all the routes that could possibly connect the Atlantic seaboard to the western waters, by which that meant the Ohio, Mississippi River system or the Great Lakes. And he said there's only one logical route to connect the two, and that is up the Hudson River to Albany, across upstate New York to Lake Erie, and then follow the chain of Great Lakes. And that was a fine idea for like New York City. But of course, every other state on the Atlantic seaboard said, well, if New York gets a canal, they're going to become the dominant state in the Union and destroy the rest of us. And that's why all the other states, Maryland, subsidized Baltimore and Ohio. Pennsylvania supported the main line of public works, later replaced with the Pennsylvania Railroad, as another way of getting to the western waters. And so that notion of poaching each other's traffic persisted even into the railroad era, because cities like Atlanta or New York, Chicago are served by multiple railroads. And it's just like the airport in Atlanta. Delta may be the dominant carrier, but as long as I can fly Southwest for a cheaper price, that kind of limits what Delta can charge. And so obviously Southwest is trying to poach market share from Delta, Delta's trying to poach market share from Southwest. And that's what the railroads did too for their traffic. They were trying to get traffic from each other's lines. And the theory was, turned out to be wrong, but the theory was that if the Erie could provide service on 6-foot gauge track, once it's loaded in cars that operate on 6-foot gauge, there's no economical way to move that cargo to a standard gauge car. And so that cargo is going to stay on the Erie all the way from, say, Ohio to basically Jersey City or Hoboken, I guess, is where it wound up. It turned out that interchange among carriers became much more important later on, but that's kind of a different story. So that's a very long, but I hope that answered both of your questions. So, yeah. Yes.
So when railroads form, when railroads are issued charters, and some of them were established as banking companies as well. Did the two organizations operate as sister companies, or was there a corporate hierarchy, or did it just vary by case by case?
Yeah, I couldn't give any specifics. I think sister companies about sums it up in most cases. So, yeah.
So no, there wasn't much influence one over the other, or was there much influence of one over the other, or not?
Yeah, not as far as I know. I mean, it was not common, or at least the practice of chartering simultaneously a railroad and banking company didn't last for very long. We're talking 1830s. Really, it kind of, after the financial panic and depression of the late 1830s, the whole kind of mindset about corporate charters changed quite a bit. So really, it's a fairly narrow band from, say, the early 1830s to the mid to late 1830s that these companies were chartered as railroads and banking companies.
Okay. Also, I have to ask, is that the super local to Augusta?
I don't know precisely. I have to look it up and see which it is. It could be, it is Georgia somewhere, but I don't know exactly where it is. Yes?
Do you have any insight into why Amtrak would not want to originally go through Atlanta? That's just wild to me. That's a huge gap in the middle down there.
Well, they wanted to make sure, as part of the Amtrak kind of initial system plan that went into place in 1971, they wanted to ensure that Atlanta had passenger service. So what Amtrak did in 1971 was they approached railroads that offered passenger service. And they said basically, okay, here's your buy-in. Here's what you have to pay to get into the system. And in return for that initial buy-in, you never have to worry about the expense of passenger service again. And there were 3 railroads that kind of balked at that. One was the Rock Island, that basically didn't have enough money to buy into the system. The other was the Denver and Rio Grande Western, where money was partly an issue, but they also wanted to maintain what was really a very popular service through the Rockies between Denver and Salt Lake City. So that stayed, for a while at least, in the hands of a private operator. And then the Southern, in part because they didn't want to spend the money to join Amtrak, but also out of corporate pride, right? I mean, it's maybe hard to believe there's a time when railroad executives, really were invested in ensuring that, passenger service ran on time, equipment was clean and well maintained, because it was symbolic of the railroad that it operated on. And so I think it was partly the money and partly corporate pride that the Southern said, okay, we're not joining Amtrak, but we do agree to continue the service, right? Because under the rules of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC has to permit, because again, these are chartered companies. So as chartered companies, they get certain sovereign rights, like eminent domain. But in return, they have to do certain things for the people, like maintain passenger service. So a railroad cannot simply say, you know what, we're going to get rid of this passenger train. The Interstate Commerce Commission has got to sign off on it. And there's no way the ICC would have allowed the Southern to simply abandon passenger service between Washington and New Orleans. So eventually what happened is in 1979, Southern said, it's been fun, but we're done here. And that's it. So Atlanta always had passenger service, never lost it. It just didn't get Amtrak service until 1979, about 8 years after Amtrak was formed.
Other questions?
Sorry, I'm I guess you would think Amtrak, like you mentioned, cut into the market share. You still think they'd want to attempt to do that with their Chicago, Florida service that you went
Floridian, yes. The Floridian is coming back, actually, at least the name is, because Amtrak is combining 2 of its trains, and I can never keep them straight. It's the Silver Star or the Silver Meteor. I can't remember which one it is.
I think it's
Silver Meteor, yeah. They're combining it with the Cardinal. No, sorry, not the Cardinal. That's not going to work. The Capital Limited. So it's a train that's going to run basically from Miami to Washington, and then from Washington it's going to head west, eventually to Pittsburgh and then Chicago. So it will now be possible for someone to get on a coach or a sleeping car in Chicago and ride without getting off all the way to Miami. It's a kind of a long and indirect ride, and there are real questions about whether or not Amtrak can, the point is, if the train arrives late at an intermediate point like Washington, will they be able to, maintain on-time departures from Washington? We'll see. But in terms of restarting direct service from Chicago to, say, Miami by the way of Atlanta, the tracks are there, well, there's a fundamental difference, I should point out, between the American Railroad Network in 1971, when Amtrak started, and the American Railroad Network today. In 1971, there was substantial excess capacity. Lots and lots of lines that carried very little traffic. The railroad industry was in serious trouble, and the formation of Amtrak to alleviate the railroads of their passenger service burden certainly helped. But what really helped was 1980, the passage of the Staggers Act, which largely deregulated the railroad industry and empowered railroad executives to make all kinds of changes. And the results from a freight railroading perspective have been spectacular. We have far fewer miles of track today than we did in 1980. but it hauls more freight than it ever has, and very efficiently too. The problem is that most of those lines that are still in service are now at capacity. And so freight railroads like Norfolk Southern are understandably reluctant to cancel one of their freight trains to put on a passenger train in its place, which is going to pay them a lot less money. And they're also reluctant to make capacity improvements that will allow them to offer more service. And so, you know, the question is who's going to pay for it? And I don't think any railroad, Norfolk Southern, CSX, Union Pacific, you know, any of those companies, they have no objection to, you know, say, having passenger service over a new route, like Chicago to Florida. What they would do though is they would say to Amtrak, here's a list of the capacity improvements we need, and here's what it's going to cost you. And the amount, I'm just very much ballparking it, to increase capacity to allow direct Chicago to Florida service with Atlanta, $10-ish billion. I mean, that's a rough guess. A lot, in other words. And of course, Amtrak pushes back and says, well, you know, if we pay for increased capacity, that's going to benefit the freight railroads because, you know, they'll operate more freight trains. So, and then that's what the lawyers get involved. And that's why it's taken so long to restart New Orleans to Mobile passenger service, because of all the arguments over not the service itself, but who's going to pay for the capacity improvements. So yeah, there's no reason technically why service cannot be offered, but it would require a huge upfront investment and a lot of, I won't say, well, yeah, it would be legal battles. Let's call it negotiation between Amtrak and the freight railroads to make that happen.
You mentioned the liability, like if there's an accident, who's at fault?
Yeah, liability. Now, Amtrak is self-insured. Amtrak does not have an insurance carrier. Most railroads are self-insured. So, as I understand the law, if an Amtrak train, you know, has a serious accident, for whatever reason, Amtrak will, you know, deal with the liability. Now, that doesn't mean that if there was, you know, a broken rail or something, that an individual would not sue, you know, on behalf of their deceased spouse or whatever. They would sue Norfolk Southern or some other company.
Yeah, I get it. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's again, that's where the lawyers get involved.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was referring to. Is like if something like from track work or something like that, something beyond Amtrak's control.
The problem, of course, is that, you know, ideally, a railroad would love to operate trains, every train exactly the same length, exactly the same weight, moving exactly the same speed in exactly the same direction. Doesn't work that way. It's hard enough to mix different kinds of freight trains together on the same track, but when you put a short, fast passenger train, relatively fast passenger train, on the same track as, you know, a 1.5 mile long coal train moving at half that speed, it becomes much more difficult to.
Well, we want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for being here.